Hey, you.
Quality content.
It's Mrs. Klein.
And Mr. Creighton.
We are here today, you guys, for your Lesson 23 podcast that's entitled The Influence of Neighboring Cultures on Japan. As always, we have a guiding question, and for this lesson, it is, in what ways did neighboring cultures influence Japan?
And our terms: meditation, pagoda, Prince Shitoku, and Shinto. And a reminder, you can follow along on page 321 to page 329. So looking at page 321, the introduction. The island country of Japan lies just off the eastern coast of the Asian mainland. Japan's culture was enriched by borrowing from other places in Asia between the 6th and 9th centuries CE.
Many ideas traveled to Japan by way of the Korean peninsula, but some of these ideas originally came from China and India.
In 593, a female ruler, Empress Suiko, came to power in Japan. Her nephew, Prince Shitoku, admired Chinese and Korean culture and encouraged contact with these mainland countries.
Over the next 300 years, Japan absorbed elements of culture, objects, ideas, and customs from the Asian mainland. As you may remember, the spread of cultural elements is called cultural diffusion. In this lesson, you will learn how cultural diffusion with India, China, and Korea helped to shape medieval Japanese culture, including its language, art, architecture, and music. You will discover how the Japanese blended ideas from other cultures into their own unique civilization.
All right, looking at section 1, cultural influences on Japan. By the time Emperor Suiko and Prince Shitoku came to power in 593, cultural influences from the Asian mainland had been reaching Japan for hundreds of years. For example, craftspeople from the Korean peninsula had brought knowledge of bronze casting and advanced ironwork to Japan.
However, as Suiko, Shitoku, and later rulers sought out contact with the mainland, the pace of cultural diffusion quickened.
Japan in Emperor Suiko's and Prince Shitoku's day was a rural agricultural society.
Japan at this time was far from being a unified country. Power was divided among chiefs of a number of clans called Uji.
Under Suiko, Shitoku, and later rulers, the government of Japan took an active interest in Korean and Chinese culture. Sometimes knowledge of mainland culture came from Japanese who traveled to China.
Sometimes it came from Korean workers who settled in Japan, bringing their knowledge and skills with them.
During the next 3 centuries, Japan sent officials, students, translators, and monks on ships across the sea to China.
As a result of these contacts, the Japanese acquired new ideas in government, the arts, architecture, and writing.
The Japanese did not just change their old ways for new ways, however. Instead, they blended new ideas with their own traditions to create a unique culture.
All right, you guys, we're going to move now into section 2, government, imitating the Chinese system. Starting with Prince Shitoku, Japanese rulers adopted new ideas about government from China.
The emperor in China was the sole ruler, whereas in Japan, the emperor had only loose control over the semi-independent Uji.
While Japanese emperors depended on local leaders, the Chinese emperor ruled with the help of a bureaucracy of government officials.
During the 7th and 8th century, Japanese rulers adopted the Chinese style of government.
Later rulers went much further in bringing Chinese-style changes to Japan.
By the 700s, Japan's imperial government looked much like China's. It was strongly centralized and supported by large bureaucracy.
Okay, all right, moving on to number 3, about city design, adapting Chinese ideas for a magnificent city. In 710, the imperial government built a Chinese-style capital on the site of the modern city of Nara.
The new city was a smaller version of Chang'an, China's capital.
There was one major difference between the two capitals. Chang'an was surrounded by a wall as protection against enemies. Nara did not have a wall.
All right, guys, looking at section 4, which is religion. Nara's Buddhist temples were another result of cultural diffusion.
Japan's original religion was Shinto. This religion expresses the love and respect of the Japanese for nature.
Instead of emphasizing a code of morality, Shinto stressed purifying whatever is unclean, such as dirt, wounds, and disease. Most of all, however, Shinto celebrated life and the beauty of nature.
In contrast, Buddhists see life as full of pain and suffering. To escape this cycle, one must follow a moral code called the Eightfold Path, which emphasizes showing respect for others, acting rightly, and achieving wisdom through meditation.
The influence of Chinese culture brought Buddhism to Korea. Mahayana Buddhism arrived in Japan in 552 when a Korean king sent the Japanese emperor a statue of the Buddha and a recommendation for the new religion.
After a fierce controversy, the emperor and his court adopted the new religion.
Buddhism did not replace Shinto. Instead, both religions thrived and even blended.
All right, you guys, section 5 is all about writing. Ancient Japanese was only a spoken language. The Japanese had no writing system of their own.
First, Japanese scholars began using kanji, or Chinese writing, to write Japanese words.
By 900, the Japanese invented kana, which means borrowed letters in Japanese. In kana, simplified Chinese characters represent Japanese syllables.
Both kanji and kana are still part of the written Japanese.
All right, moving on to literature. The earliest literary works in Japan were poems that date from the 7th and 8th centuries. Using Chinese characters, Japanese poets developed a form of poetry called tanka.
All right, looking at section 7, sculpture. Like Buddhism, new techniques and subjects of sculpture came to Japan from Korea and China. Meanwhile, Buddhism was inspiring new subjects for sculpture on the Asian mainland. As these ideas moved east, sculpture techniques and materials gradually changed.
From the middle of the 6th century to the middle of the 7th century, Chinese and Korean immigrants created most of Japan's religious art. Japanese artists learned new techniques from them.
All right, guys, looking on section 8, architecture adapting temple designs. New forms of temple design came to Japan from India by the way of China. In India, Buddhist monasteries featured shrines called stupas, with roofs shaped like bells or inverted bowls. The Chinese replaced the bell shape with a series of stones and curved roofs, creating structures called pagodas.
When Buddhism arrived in Japan, the Japanese adopted the pagoda design.
All right, guys, our last section is section 9 on music. Japan's native music consisted of chanted poems, war songs, folk songs, and Shinto prayers.
As contacts with the Asian mainland increased, the Japanese imported music from the region, especially from China. Gogoku, a form of Chinese court music, arrived in Japan in the 6th century.
New kinds of music required new musical instruments. One of the most interesting was a wind instrument the Chinese called a sheng, which the Japanese called a sho.
All right, you guys, to wrap it up, our summary. In this lesson, we learned how from the 6th to the 9th centuries, the Japanese acquired and adapted elements of other Asian cultures, creating a unique civilization.
All right, starting off with cultural influences on Japan, objects, ideas, skills, and customs flowed to Japan from India, China, and Korea, encouraged by Prince Shotoku and other early Japanese rulers.
All right, government and cities. From China, the Japanese borrowed the idea of a strong central government supported by a bureaucracy. To house the imperial government, they built a new capital modeled after China's capital city.
Religion. Buddhism, which began in India, came to Japan from China by way of Korea. Buddhism strongly influenced Japanese religion, art, and architecture.
All right, writing and literature. Koreans introduced Chinese writing to Japan. The Japanese invented kanji and kana to write Japanese words and sounds with Chinese characters. Poets used Chinese characters to write tanka, a type of poetry based on Chinese models.
Sculpture, architecture, and music. Like Buddhism, ideas about sculpture traveled from India to Korea and China and then to Japan. Similarly, India's stupas inspired Chinese pagodas. Japan then adopted this architectural style. New kinds of music, such as gogoku and instruments, came to Japan from China.
All right, you guys, remember the guiding question: in what ways did neighboring cultures influence Japan?
And really quick, your vocab: meditation, pagoda, Prince Shotoku, and Shinto.
All right, you guys, bye.
Logging off.